region of the brain we're going to discuss, and that is the cerebral hemispheres. Cerebral hemispheres make up about 83% of the brain mass. It's the biggest part of our brain, and you can imagine that this set of slides is going to take a few minutes to get through because of that, a little longer than the other sections probably. So when you look at the cerebral hemispheres, you'll notice they have parts that come up, we call ridges, grooves where they go down because of that folding. Those are called, the ridges are called gyri. The shallow grooves are called sulci. There are some deeper grooves called fissures. There's one called the longitudinal fissures that separates the two hemispheres, the left and right hemispheres. There's a transverse cerebral fissure that's going to separate the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So here's our longitudinal fissure. We have one lobe, then another lobe. This one still has the arteries and veins in place. This one they've been removed. The transverse cerebral fissure separates the cerebrum, what we're talking about now, from the cerebellum. We'll get to later. That's involved in movement, planning movements. So the cerebral hemisphere, the sulci divided into hemispheres and then into lobes. Those lobes are named, except for one, for the bone that covers them from the skull. So if you did a good job memorizing skull bones, it'll help you with knowing the cerebral hemispheres. The first is the frontal lobe, covered by the frontal bone, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and then the lobe that is not named for a bone that covers it because it's buried kind of deep in the cerebral is the insula. So the first four, again, are named after the overlying bones. The insula is buried, is covered by parts of the temporal, parietal, and frontal lobes. Here's the rotating brain. And we froze up. Oh, here we go. Yeah. So here's our frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the temporal lobe we pull out of the way, here's the occipital lobe. And if you pull those down, you see retract them, you see the insula buried deep underneath them. So the major sulci divide the lobes are the central sulcus that separates the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe from the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. And those gyri are going to come up here shortly. The parieto-occipital sulcus separates the occipital and parietal lobe, and the lateral sulcus outlines the temporal lobe. So those sulci divide the lobes. Each hemisphere has three basic regions, and this is going from out to in. The cerebral cortex is the gray matter you can see when you look at an intact brain. Below that, there are tracts of myelinated fibers that make up white matter. And within that white matter, there are places where there are other cell bodies called nuclei. And those are the basal nuclei in the cerebral hemisphere. So the cerebral cortex is our executive suite. It's a place where our conscious mind is constructed. It's where what we owe awareness to, sensory perception, voluntary motor movement, communication, memory storage, understanding. It is not very thick, especially the cell body part. It's only 2 to 4 millimeters in depth. That gray matter is neuron cell bodies, dendrites connecting to other neurons, glial cells, support cells, blood vessels, but not axons. The axons are going to make their way into the white matter. And this cerebral cortex makes up about 40% of the mass of the brain. There's a lot of computing function up there. We can use different imaging now, PET and MRI, to show motor and sensory functions are located in discrete areas we'll call domains. Most higher functions are spread out over many areas. The fact of the matter is a lot of the information we have about what happens where in the brain has historically come from patients who have suffered injuries or accidents to their brain, and we know what functions they've lost. That's changing. We now have these active imaging methods that are allowing us to see what's happening in normal brains, and that's a very important part of research. So here we use some functional imaging. This is an fMRI. We can see that this area is lit up when we are seeing something, this area when we are hearing something, this one when we are speaking. But when we are thinking, it's going to involve all kinds of those same sensations and all kinds of different parts of the brain. There are 4 things to consider with the cortex. It has 3 types of functional areas. Those that are motor areas that are used for controlling voluntary movements. There are sensory areas where we make conscious awareness of the sensations coming into us. And then association areas are going to integrate that motor and sensory information to help us make sense out of what it means. Each hemisphere is concerned with the contralateral side of the body, so the right side does control, in general, the left side, and the left side does, in general, control the right side. There is some lateralization. Cortical functions only, in some cases, only occur in one hemisphere. But the idea of a right brain person or a left brain person is completely wrong. All conscious behavior involves the entire cortex, both sides, in one way or another. So let's look at the motor areas. Most of those are in the frontal lobe. They act to control voluntary movement. Some important ones include the primary motor cortex, which is in the precentral gyrus, the premotor cortex, which is anterior to the precentral gyrus, Broca's area, which is anterior and below the premotor area, and the frontal eye field, which is within the anterior premotor cortex above Broca's area, shown here. So primary motor cortex, premotor cortex, frontal eye field, and this region, this is Wernicke's. This is Broca's area over here. So that primary somatic motor cortex is located in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. It has pyramidal cells in it, which are large neurons that allow conscious control of precise skeletal movements. They connect to pyramidal or corticospinal tracts that are long axons projecting down to the spinal cord. Somatotropy, all the muscles in the body are mapped to an area on the primary motor cortex. And we have what we use for research as what is known as a motor homunculi, which is an upside-down caricature that represents the contralateral motor innervation of body regions. So here's our motor homunculi. See, it's an exaggerated drawing. Some parts are bigger than they should be, than we expect, and some are smaller than we expect. And that's because the size of those areas are related to the number of muscles that the nervous system is controlling in that area. So we have relatively small forehead, but a lot of muscles in our mouth and lips. And we will see a sensory one on the other side when we get there. That premotor cortex helps to plan movements. It's a staging area for skilled motor activities, controls learning, repetitive and pattern motor skills, coordinates simultaneous and sequential actions, controls voluntary actions that depend on sensory feedback. Another region is Broca's area. It's only in one hemisphere, and that hemisphere in most is usually the left. It directs speech production, the muscles that control speech production, and it's active in planning speech and voluntary motor activities. The frontal eye fields control voluntary eye movements. So here's that central sulcus, and what we've been talking about is what's in front of it. So this is the precentral gyrus. It's a gyrus that's in front of the central sulcus. Damage to an area of the primary motor cortex, which can happen in a stroke, is going to paralyze the muscles controlled by that area, and that will happen on the opposite side of the body from the injury. So a stroke on the left side of the body would affect movement on the right side of the body in general. Muscle strength and the ability to perform discrete individual movements would not be impaired. Only control over the movement is lost. So damage to the premotor area controlling the movement of the fingers would still move, but the voluntary control that you would have over that movement would be lost. Other premotor neurons can be reprogrammed to take over that skill, and that is going to require a lot of practice, just like the initial job of learning to do it did. And that is why occupational therapy is very important following stroke. The cerebral cortex sensory areas are areas of the cortex concerned with conscious awareness of sensation. We find them in the parietal, the insular, temporal, and occipital lobes. There are 8 main areas, including the primary sensory, somatosensory cortex, somatosensory association, visual, auditory, vestibular, olfactory, gustatory, and visceral sensory areas. The primary somatosensory cortex is located in the postcentral gyri of the parietal lobe, so just behind the motor somatomotor cortex. It gets general sensory information from the skin and proprioceptors of skeletal muscles, joints, and tendons. It's capable of spatial discrimination. It knows what part of your body is sending the signal based on the location it is coming from. And it also has one of these homunculi. This one is a somatosensory homunculus. So it is an upside down caricature representing the contralateral sensory input from body regions. So in this side, the size of the body part is related to the amount of sensation coming through. You can see that the fingers are very big, the hand is big, the wrist is kind of small, the forearm rather small, because we get a lot of sensory information from our hands, a lot of sensory information from our face. And when this region is signaled, this is the spatial discrimination. When this region is signaled, it means it's coming from here. Somatosensory association cortex is posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex. It integrates sensory input from the primary somatosensory cortex. It helps us to understand an object. It's going to give us ideas about things such as size, texture, and the relationship of the parts that we are feeling. The visual areas include the primary visual striate cortex, which is on the extreme posterior tip of the occipital lobe. Mostly it's buried in the calcanean sulcus. It receives visual information from the retinas, and then that information is passed to visual association areas which surround that primary visual cortex, and the visual association areas use past experience to interpret the visual stimuli. They'll give us ideas about color, form, movement. The ability to recognize faces is here. And complex processing is going to involve the entire posterior half of the cerebral hemisphere. It takes a lot of learning to figure out vision, which is also the sense that we can most easily fool. Auditory areas would include the primary auditory cortex and the auditory association areas. The auditory cortex is going to interpret information from the inner ear, things like pitch, location, and loudness, while the association areas are going to take memories of sound and help us perceive what we are hearing currently. The vestibular cortex is part of the insula, adjacent to the parietal cortex. It is responsible for our awareness of balance, our position of our head in space. The primary olfactory cortex, which is involved in smell, is in the medial aspect of the temporal lobes. It's part of the primitive rhinencephalon, along with the olfactory bulbs and tracts. The rest of the rhinencephalon in humans is going to become part of the limbic system, and it's involved in our conscious awareness of odors, which is because of all this primitive and the rhinencephalon and the limbic system, one of the reasons that odors are very good to trigger memories. Gustatory cortex is in the insula, deep to the temporal lobe. It's involved in our perception of taste, whether we like something or don't like something. The visceral sensory area is behind the gustatory cortex, and that's where we have conscious perception of sensations of our viscera, things like an upset stomach, a full bladder, so on. Damage to the primary visual cortex can result in functional blindness, contrasting individuals with a damaged visual association area can see, but they can't comprehend what they are looking at. So there are multimodal association areas that are going to receive input from multiple sensory areas, send output to multiple areas. They're going to allow us to give meaning to the information we receive, store it in memory, tie it to previous experiences, and help us come up with a plan of action. Sensations, thoughts, emotions become consciousness. They make us who we are. Won't try to tell you that we understand all this stuff, but we are making progress, and there are some things we do know. So we can broadly divide this multimodal association area into three parts: anterior, posterior, and limbic association areas. The anterior association area is also called the prefrontal cortex. It is the most complicated of the cortical regions. We know it's involved with intellect, involved with cognition, our ability to recall, and our personality is held within this area. It has working memory that we need for dealing with abstract ideas, making judgments, reasoning, being persistent, and planning. Its development is going to depend greatly on feedback from our social environment. So if you ever ask the question, is it nature or nurture? It's equal amounts of both. Posterior association area is a large region in the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes, plays a role in recognizing patterns and faces, as well as localizing us in space. It's also involved in understanding written and spoken language. In particular, there's an area there called Wernicke's area. The limbic association is part of the limbic system. It involves the cingulate gyrus, the parahippocampal gyrus, and the hippocampus, and it is going to provide emotional impacts. This is going to make a scene important to us, and this is very important in establishing memories. Tumors and other lesions of the anterior association area can cause mental and personality disorders, including loss of judgment, loss of attentiveness, loss of inhibitions. Affected individuals may be oblivious to social restraints, becoming careless about their personal appearance, or may take unnecessary risks. Different problems are going to arise in those with lesions of the posterior association area, which provides awareness of self in space. Here, individuals may refuse to wash or dress the side of the body that's opposite on the lesion. It doesn't seem that they don't believe that part of their body belongs to them, even when they look at it in a mirror. Though, again, we have lateralization of some cortical functions, but don't make too much out of this. They're a division of labor between hemispheres. They are not identical. Cerebral dominance refers to the hemisphere that is dominant just for language, and for 90% of humans, it is a left-sided dominance. That usually results in being right-handed. In the other 10%, the hemispheres are reversed. But again, it is way too naive to think of someone being left-brained or right-brained. The left hemisphere in general controls language, math, and logic, while the right hemisphere is involved in visual spatial skills, intuition, emotion, artistic, and musical skills. The hemispheres are constantly communicating with one another almost instantaneously through fiber tracks and functional integration. So I can't stress